Well, it is a beautiful but frosty morning here in bear camp in October. It looks a lot different around here than it did a month and a half ago when the camp was full of bear hunters. But I thought it would just be a good time to enjoy the sunshine and a campfire here this morning and answer some of your questions. And I've got quite a few of them. They just keep coming. They're good questions, they're insightful, and I'm not sure I can get them all in this video, but I'm going to do the ones that I've got right now, and if I need to, I'll just include them in another video after this one. But let's start here with the question: can a big bear take over a bait and push others off the bait and claim it as his? I would say that it's rare for that to happen. Big bears typically come in at the prime times, and the other bears just have to deal with it, and that's why a lot of times you'll see bears in the morning, you'll see bears at noon, and maybe earlier in the afternoon tends to be the smaller bears, the subordinate bears, sows with cubs and so forth. Those types of bears will not be able to feed at prime time because the biggest bear is there. So I have seen times when a big bear will lay up fairly close to the bait, and other bears are more nervous and unlikely to come in, and if they have other opportunities, if they know where other baits are, they may just decide it's just better to go to a different bait. So I would say the answer to that is really, it's not common for a bear to just take over a bait, but if there is a big mature bear on a bait, he's going to pretty much rule it, although he can't just sit there all the time and keep other bears from coming and going and eating the bait. So that's about the best answer I have for that. If a bait goes cold for 2 weeks, will the bears come back? That's a tough one, because if a bait goes cold for 2 weeks, the chances are the bears still know where that bait is, but they might be a long ways away. You know, the GPS collars that we have on these bears nowadays have taught us some things that are pretty surprising, and we have learned that the bears know where the best acorns are, and they can travel 20, 30, 40 miles, and they left your baits, and while they know where your bait is, they might be gone for 2 weeks to a month to these other areas, and then they might just go to their denning spots from there. So, you know, ideally we want to have baits that have multiple bears on them, and if one or two leave, you still have bears available to you. But the chances of them coming back are, man, you just don't know, because some bears don't travel that far. They know where that bait is, and if they're starting to clean up the natural foods, which is probably the reason why they left, then the chances are they'll probably be back, or another bear will find it. But we do have the situation where they might be 20, 30 miles or more away, and they might not come back before the end of the season. So the short answer to that is maybe, but we really don't know where the bears are, and that would determine whether or not they're going to be back within a week or two or whatever. Here's a question that's pretty interesting, and it's a pretty common misconception. I saw a post on Facebook where the person claims to be an expert on bear behavior, and he says that bears patrol a 15.5 square mile territory. Well, I'm going to tell you that bears don't patrol anything. They have what could be considered a home range, but they don't try to protect it from other bears. They're not patrolling the edges of it. You know, bears interact back and forth. They have a pecking order. They establish that by fighting, and once they fight, you know, they probably don't have to fight again, at least for a few years, as maybe one ages and loses some of its strength or something. They just have this pecking order, and they come across each other all the time. Their home ranges overlap. They can be feeding pretty close together at baits. They can be feeding pretty close together at natural food sites. Like I've seen them feeding on blueberries 20 feet apart and don't seem to care. You know, some white oak trees might have 3 or 4 bears feeding within, you know, a quarter of an acre, and they just don't seem to care. They're not patrolling anything. And the home range, I don't know where this 15.5 square mile number came from. Don't put too much emphasis on home range. Bears are driven by the need to be secure, by food, and by breeding. And so in the spring, you know, June and July when they're breeding, you know, all bets are off. But the rest of the year, it's pretty much security cover, bedding cover, and food. And they know where the berries are, they know where the blueberries are, they know the raspberries, they know where the hazelnuts are and the best oak trees. They know where it all is. That's where they're gonna be. And if they gotta travel a ways for it, so, you know, when you think of something like a home range, it makes you like think of like there's this area, like it's a square or a circle or something like that. Well, a bear's primary area of activity, which is a better phrase than a home range, you know, rather than being a, you know, a specific area, it might be 2 miles of a lake shore, a couple of feeder creeks that come up and down. It might be a cedar swamp over here, and he might travel back and forth, and then he makes his forays out to where the blueberries are. And so the home range, you know, it could be completely different in June and July as it is in August, and then completely different again in September. You know, just don't put too much emphasis on home range at all. Bears travel widely. Just keep that in mind, especially the mature males. They can try. I've known one case in which a mature male traveled 14 miles in one night. I also know a case in which a sow with cubs traveled 8 miles in about 6 hours. And that's booking right along when you think about it for cubs that are going through the woods and climbing over logs and swimming streams and crossing roads and things like that. And I guess in this case it was wilderness area where there wasn't any roads. But anyway, just keep in mind that bears travel widely and they know where the food is and they go wherever they have to go. Forget about confining them to a home range or thinking that they're actually patrolling a home range. It just doesn't happen. Okay, good question. It comes up a lot. How can I hunt mourning bears? Here's the problem with hunting mourning bears is it's really difficult to get to the bait and settled in the stand without spooking the bears, because most of the time the bears, if they're not actually on your camera, they're just right there. They're within a few yards of the bait, and if they're showing up just after daylight, you got to try to get in there before daylight without spooking them. It's just really, really rare that it works. I just don't. I've only one time put one of my hunters, as I've been guiding, on a bait before daylight. Didn't work. I've hunted mornings a few times in Canada. I know people that have shot bears in the morning, but it's kind of a long shot. It's just really difficult to pull off. So I would say generally it's not a good idea because of the risk of spooking those bears. And any time of the day that you spook a bear off the bait, it's just never good to spook a bear off the bait at any time. So there are people from time to time who are successful in getting in there and shooting a bear in the morning, but generally it's pretty tough. And the other thing is, if bears feel comfortable at a bait site and you go in at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you get in your stand and you happen to bump a bear that was on the bait or close to the bait, there's still a fairly good chance that that bear could come back before dark if it's a bait where they've consistently felt secure and been coming to quite a bit. You see this in Canada all the time. It's very common in wilderness areas where bears have very little experience, negative experience with humans. But in the places where bears interact with humans quite a bit and are receiving a fair amount of hunting pressure, particularly here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and so forth, just spooking a bear off the bait at any time is a recipe for probably not having a chance to kill that bear. So morning hunts are really, really tough. That's all I got to say. If you can pull it off, more power to you. Okay, here's a funny one. What is the dumbest advice you've ever heard on Facebook? This could be a video in itself, because you know, the problem with Facebook is that everybody can have an opinion even if they don't know what they're talking about. And there's a lot of people that are absolutely clueless, and a lot of people just pass along things that they've heard over the years. Like, you know, I think Probably, if you want to see the dumbest advice possible on Facebook, just put a post on one of the bear hunting forums and ask, how do you get a nocturnal bear to come in during the daylight? That will probably generate a bunch of them. Somebody, I guarantee you, somebody is going to say, take the bait out. This might be the dumbest one, too. Somebody's going to say, take the bait out. Somebody else is going to say, use anise instead of what you're using. Somebody else is going to say, spook the bear off the bait in the dark by flashing lights or a radio playing at night so they'll come in during the day. Anytime you feel like you're doing something that's trying to manipulate a bear, trying to force the bear to do something that isn't natural to him, forget it. It's not going to work. You can't manipulate bears. And here, I'm going to go with this one about taking the bait out. Take the bait out with you when you leave, and that way they'll only come when the bait is there. Well, here's the problem with that. So they do come back at dark and there's no bait there. Why are they ever going to come back again? There's no bait. I mean, if you take the bait in, put it out when you're there, and then take a bait back out with you, every time that bear comes to the bait, he's not going to get rewarded with something to eat. Why would he ever come back? So that doesn't make any sense at all. It's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. Another one is hunt as much as you can. People will say, well, my bears are very irregular. I don't know when I should hunt and when I shouldn't. Well, then somebody will say, just go every chance you get so you'll be there when the bear comes. And I would challenge you not to look at it that way. I would say try to be more strategic. Try to pattern the bears. If you stay out of there and your bait is in a good location where they can approach it securely, eventually they'll work their way up into coming in the daylight. Not all of them do. Some bears are just always going to be nocturnal. They know what baiting is all about. They know you're trying to kill them, and they're just not going to come in during the daylight. But I've seen over and over again where bears that are coming in an hour or two after dark, if the bait's in a good location where they can approach it securely, everything is good, they aren't spooked, they'll come a little earlier and a little earlier, and then they'll end up coming in that last half hour. And that last half hour is the most natural times for bears to feed. So if they're nocturnal, I got multiple videos on this channel about how to handle nocturnal bears. Go back and watch them if you want to know more about this, so I won't go into any more details on that right now. So lots of dumb advice on Facebook. Take it all with a grain of salt. Just keep in mind that a lot of people giving this advice have no idea what they're talking about, have probably only killed one yearling bear in their whole life, and that now they consider themselves someone that's capable of giving you advice. So careful. Here's two questions that are very similar from two different people. When do bears go into hibernation and what triggers it? And the other one is, where are the den sites located and when do they head there? So we have a lot of good information on this. As we have more and more bears that have GPS collars on them, and we can track them every step of the way, every day, and so forth. And by the way, I think it's kind of interesting that the DNR researchers, they know right where my baits are, some of them, because I got GPS collared bears that come to my baits, and they have to be looking at the track of where these bears are going, and then looking at it and going, well, there's one of Bernie's baits right there, because that bear sure has spent a lot of time right there. So we do know a lot more than we ever used to. So we do know where they're denning, and we know quite a bit about when they head there, of course. I would like to learn more about why bears choose specific areas to den in. So that we do know that bears are migrating, multiple bears migrate to certain areas to den. And it apparently has the habitat that they like and so forth. And this is something I hope the DNR does more research on and hopefully does a report on at some point, because I'm very interested in why they migrate to certain areas, and some of them go a long ways. We had a bear that tagged that's right around this area here by camp that denned on top of the ground in a cedar swamp about 30 miles from here. There's a lot we don't know about why they go to specific areas, but we do know when they den and pretty much what triggers it. So what triggers bears to go into the den will probably surprise you. And I learned this about 10 years ago. It was the first time I'd ever heard of. I was getting ready to go to a bear hunt in Maine, and I was on the phone with Randy. I forget the name. What was his last name? He was a biologist, a bear biologist in Maine at that time. He's since retired. And I was talking to him about it, and it was about 10th or 11th of October. And he said, you know, I don't think you should come. I think you ought to wait till next year. And I said, why? And he said, well, he says there was a low amount of natural foods this year, and all of our bears that have collars on them that we're tracking, they almost all went into the den in a 48-hour period. He said between Friday night and the early hours of Monday morning, I think he said 6 bears had GPS collars, and 5 of them went into the den in this very short amount of time. And they're not in all one area. They were pretty much scattered around the state. And I said, well, what would trigger that? I mean, did you have a cold snap? Did it snow? And he goes, no. He said it's the lack of natural food. And I went, but there's a lot of baits out there. And he goes, it doesn't matter. He said it's the lack of natural foods that triggers them to go into the den. When they just get to a point, I guess you could say, where it's a point of diminishing returns, where they're eating natural foods, and then maybe they hit a point where it costs as much energy to acquire the natural foods as they're gaining from them, then it's time to go in the den. So it's not weather, and he said the baits won't trigger it. If they've got lots of baits to eat, they're designed to go into the den when they have enough fat or they're lacking natural food, and they'll go into the den a little earlier. And all those bears went in the den pretty much all at once. One of the most important things I learned from that was that baiting bears doesn't really change what bears are designed to do. We sometimes think we're putting baits out there and we're doing some kind of a big favor or something like that. And baits will never be more than a supplemental food source for bears, except in extreme cases and for short periods of time if there's a failure of natural foods. So that's pretty fascinating stuff about when bears go into the den and what triggers it, in my opinion. Here's a good question. Have you tried out natural foods like acorns for bait? And the answer to that is yes, I have. I have picked up buckets of acorns and taken them to a bear bait. I have also put bear baits in areas where there are a lot of acorns. Like I found an oak ridge with several white oak acorns, and there was bear crap, and the bears were obviously eating it, and I put a bait there. That bait sat there for 7, 8, 9 days, never got opened, while the bears were feeding on acorns they had to be within less than 100 yards of it multiple times. They were feeding throughout that area. Didn't touch it. I've seen situations in which the bears are readily feeding on acorns, but when I put the acorns on my bait, they scratched the acorns aside and ate the rest of the bait. Got to be something about just not being natural to come across a pile of acorns that are covered with logs or something like that. I don't know. It just didn't work. Okay, here is 2 questions from the same person. How many cubs do bears have in the first litter, and how long do females age before they start to breed? This is a good question for a biologist, actually, but I do know the answer to both of these questions. The answer is it varies. So in really good habitat, a female bear will breed typically when it's 3 years old for the first time. And even in quality habitat, they might not breed until 4, but it's usually 3 or 4 if they have lots of food, they're very healthy, and they're in really good quality habitat. In areas where they don't have as much food and they grow a little slower, and I'm talking, you know, Canadian wilderness areas, let's just put it this way, there's parts of Minnesota where the bears typically breed their first time at 3 years of age, and that's in areas where they have a lot of oaks and berries and things like that. And then Other parts of Minnesota, the Canadian Shield parts of Minnesota, where they typically don't breed till they're 5 years old because they don't have as good a quality of food and habitat, and so typically the females won't have their first cubs until they're 5. So that's the determining factor. And the other part of this question is, how many cubs do they have? And I don't know if they have more as they age or not. That's a good question for a biologist, and they probably know the answer to it. I would say a yearling whitetail doe that gets bred, you know, when she's about 6-7 months old, will most often have just one fawn, but after that they'll have 2 and sometimes 3. My gut tells me that it might be somewhat similar for bears, and I would say that if you have bears that are having 3 and 4 cubs, and 3 is very common nowadays and 4 is not exceptional, those are probably more mature females in really good habitat. Does a bear more often have 1 cub the first time she breeds? I kind of doubt it. In Minnesota, the average number of cubs that they have is 2.7. So more are having 3 than are having 2. So anyway, that's enough questions for today. Hope this is interesting to you. Keep the questions coming. I'll keep answering them if I can, and if I don't know the answer, I can probably find it, or you know, I'm not too proud to say I don't know the answer. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next video.